got snubbed? No, I'm not talking about Oscar or Tony nominations. I'm talking about who exactly missed the boat to be playing in the WNBA All-Star game this year in Phoenix on July 20th. And I have Eden Laase here to parse through it all as we question, what does it really mean to be an All-Star? The Locked On Women's Basketball Podcast, it starts right now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome. You are locked on to women's basketball. I'm Jackie Powell, and I'm one of your hosts on the program. I cover the New York Liberty at The Next, and I've covered women's basketball nationally at many other places. I want to thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. And remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is brought to you all by everyone at The Next, which is a place where we cover women's basketball all the time, and we tell the stories that need to be told every day. So subscribe now to support the staff at The Next that works oh so hard to bring you this coverage that matters. It is $9 a month or $72 per year. Find us at thenexthoops.com and subscribe. And please remember that Locked On Women's Basketball is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Last time we were together, dear listener, I had Katie Barnes on for a very special episode where we spoke about what pride means to the WNBA and how far queer culture within the W has come so far. If you haven't watched or listened to that episode, please do. Pride doesn't just have to be in June. But today I have Eden here, who is a freelance journalist who specializes in women's basketball coverage, mostly the W and college, and whose work you've seen at many places, including Yahoo Sports, Just Women's Sports, and SB Nation. Eden is making her Locked On Women's Basketball debut, which is very exciting, and she is here to discuss what the voters and fans might have missed when it came to determining who is an All-Star. Also, I thought Eden would be excellent to discuss all of this because she wrote a great piece for SB Nation that argued the 7 players that absolutely should be All-Stars. I will attach that in the show notes. And so, in segment 1, we're going to plainly and simple just say who got snubbed and remind you guys of what this voting system and process was, because it's not typical. In segment 2, we're going to get into the weeds of who could the snubs have replaced, who did make it. And then in segment 3, we're going to get a little bit nerdy, and we're going to look at some dictionary definitions and talk about exactly who should be an All-Star. How do you define who is an All-Star? So anyway, enough of my voice. Eden, welcome. We're so glad you're here. First, before we get into really who we both believe got snubbed, if you could just remind the listeners of how exactly these players were voted in, because it's a little complex.
It is a little complex, and I've had to kind of refer to various sources over and over every time I write something about this because it is complicated and different than usual. So essentially what happens is Team USA is already in the All-Star game. So everyone who is going to be playing for the Olympics plays on one team. And then after that, it does voting based on fans, players, and then also journalists, and then coaches get in there too. So it's pretty crazy. It's a lot of different stuff. And it also, I think, lends itself to have more snubs per se than usual, just because of the Team USA aspect.
For sure. And it's just to expand upon that a little bit. You have, as Eden said, all of Team USA is in. But it's almost like you have some people that get in double the amount. And what I mean by that is how they start is they take the top 10 vote getters. And so a lot of those people who were the top 10 vote getters are on Team USA. And so when we say top 10 vote getters, that is where they mix in the fan vote, which gets 50%. And then you have the last 50% is split in two between media vote and player vote. So it's all cumulative and put together. And it's interesting because we don't really get to see how that's split. I feel like in past years we have.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful for a lot of people to see kind of how it shakes out. I also don't know that there's a perfect way to do it for an Olympic year, because I get that, you know, the WNBA wants the people playing on the Olympic team to be on the ballot so that they can get that All-Star designation. Teams like to know for data, you know, sponsors like to know, et cetera, who's getting the most votes. But I think it would shake out a little better if those people were just on and then voters didn't have to worry about voting for them. Because, you know, you don't, if you're on your ballot and you're like, oh, which guard should I vote for? Like, I'm torn between these two, and one is already an All-Star, maybe people would take, or one is already on the Olympic team, maybe people would take that more into account if they knew that that's how it was going to go down. But I don't know that a lot of people actually really know how the voting shakes out. Like my mom and my sisters are super big WNBA fans, but I had to explain to them like 4 times about like, here's, you know, what's going to happen with All-Stars. Like, here's who's on the Olympic team, here's who's not, etc. So I don't know that there's a perfect way to do it, but I'm not sure that the way we have is perfect, but that's just how it is.
No, that's a great point. And I think, I mean, I can say myself, you know, I voted as a part of the media this year, and I sort of, maybe this was a fault on my own, but I sort of was looking at who are just the best players in the league. That's sort of how I looked at it. I completely took out the whole USA and, you know, and not. And so I don't know, maybe that's a fault of mine, but I think for me, it just made it so much easier because it's just so complicated.
And I did the same thing in my voting, so I can't really like, you know, talk, but that's the thing. I think if it was more clear and maybe, you know, split in a different way or whatever, it would be easier to pick. But I just voted based on like, okay, if I was picking just the best players, like you said, who would I pick?
And a lot of those folks are on Team USA. But as we'll talk about later, some of them are not.
Yes, definitely.
So before we get into our first break, I just want to make it clear to our listeners who exactly we thought were snubbed. So Eden, you know, take a couple and then I'll take a couple as well.
Yeah, so my 2 biggest ones were Dijonai Carrington from The Sun, and then also Ezzy Magbegor from The Storm. I thought both of them kind of should have been locks. So.
And then on my end, it was Alanna Smith of the Minnesota Lynx and Bennaja Laney-Hamilton of the New York Liberty. And so in segment 2, we're going to really get into the weeds of the big 4 snubs that we just listed. And we're going to sort of take a look at who maybe they could have replaced. But first, I would like to tell you all about our friends at eBay Motors. eBay Motors, passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Motors, guaranteed fit, available only to U.S. customers. Thank you, eBay Motors. And now I would like to talk about our friends at Apostrophe. So, imposter syndrome is such a thing, is it not? One of the biggest things that can lead to a lack of self-confidence is your skin. Acne breakouts, rosacea, wrinkles, these can all take a toll on your confidence level. And that's why we're excited to partner with Apostrophe, one of the sponsors of this episode. So Apostrophe's goal is to help you feel confident in your own skin. Whether you're dealing with breakouts, signs of aging, or acne scarring, Apostrophe will help you love the skin that you're in. So what is Apostrophe exactly? It is an online platform that connects you with an expert dermatology team to get customized acne treatment for your unique skin. Through Apostrophe, you can get access to oral and topical medications that use clinically proven ingredients to help clear acne. Simply fill out an online consultation about your skin goals and medical history, then snap a few selfies and a dermatology provider will create a custom treatment plan just for you. Apostrophe offers access to prescription treatments for all types of acne, from hormonal acne to facial acne, even back, chest. Treat breakouts from head to toe. So personally, Apostrophe has been really helpful for me when it comes to helping me deal with my hormonal acne. It makes sure that my bumps and blemishes that can sometimes be a bit painful and put pressure on my skin aren't as painful, and they don't make such an impression, and the redness isn't that embarrassing. So Apostrophe helps to decrease that redness and pimple size. So we have a special deal for our audience. Get your first visit for only $5 at apostrophe.com/lockedon when you use our code LOCKEDON. That's a savings of $15. This code is only available to our listeners. To get started, just go to apostrophe.com/lockedon and click Get Started. Then use our code LOCKEDON at sign up, and you'll get your first visit for only $5. Thank you, Apostrophe, for sponsoring this episode. And let us get back to our program, where we are talking all about WNBA All-Star snubs. I'm here with Eden. Okay, before we get into these snubs, I do have to remind our listeners about Locked On Sports Today, which is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without some of the screaming and talking heads from ESPN or Fox Sports. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss opinions, analysis, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, here we are. We are back. So, Eden, let's really start with talking about who some of our snubs maybe could have replaced. And so where I want to start is Dijonai Carrington. I mean,
Yeah.
You mentioned her in our first segment, but take us through, I guess, why you thought she was a lock and maybe who she could have replaced.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just start with Dijonai's stats right off the bat. 13.4 points, 4.8 rebounds, 1.7 assists, and 1.1 steals per game. One of the things that really stands out to me about Dijonai is every game she has to guard the opponent's best guard, right? So she, first game of the season, she locked up Caitlin Clark, forced 10 turnovers, right? And if Caitlin Clark is going to be one of the top vote getters, then shouldn't the player who, kind of shut her down also be in there? Granted, that was CeCe's first game of the season, but Dijonai does that every game to whoever she guards. So we just saw her last night. She had a monster block at the end of the game against the Lynx to kind of help seal up that game. So for me, she should have been a lock mostly because of what she does on defense, but she's a complete player, right? The Sun, are a totally different team with her in the starting lineup. I think, she's really elevated them. Last year, she wasn't a starter. This year, she is, and she's totally taken that role and just really helped this team. I don't know that there's anybody other than maybe Alyssa Thomas on the team who's as important to the Sun as Dijonai Carrington is. As far as who she could replace, right, it's hard because we talked about, with Team USA, there's definitely people on there that maybe wouldn't be on normally, like Chelsea Gray, who's a great guard and who should definitely be on Team USA, but shouldn't be an all-star because she didn't play at all to start the season with an injury. Jewel Lloyd kind of struggled to start the season, so I could see her replacing her. But then in terms of who Carrington could replace, I think statistically she's pretty comparable to someone like Alicia Gray, so she could slide in there. And then, it comes down to, okay, well, do we care about which team is winning more? Well, we'll get into that later. But for me, that's kind of the obvious one that I feel like she could easily slide in there and I think take Gray's spot.
I think with Dijonai, and this is a good transition into Alanna Smith, I mean, Dijonai and Alanna Smith, I think, are at the top when it comes to the most improved conversation, which is interesting because Alanna Smith was at the top of the most improved conversation last year. But this year we see it a little bit more because she's on one of the best teams in the league.
Yeah.
She is on the best defensive team in the league. And again, we have another two-way player who is so impactful. And for me, it's more than just the stats. So, okay, if we do talk about the stats when it comes to Alanna Smith, so she is averaging 12.1 points. She is also averaging, and this is the real kicker here, 47.7% from three. And it's not like she's only taken 10 threes this season. No, that is not the case. She has taken, I want to say it is close to maybe 50, but I will fact check that as it loads. Okay. No, so I was close. She has made 31 of her 65 3-pointers. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Yeah. And that's a pretty big part of the Lynx's offense, because obviously it is Napheesa Collier that is the heart of that offense, what that offense is built around. And so if you think about what Fee does best, okay, so you surround what Fee does best with shooting. And so, sure, Alanna Smith is not taking as many as Kayla McBride, but she's still providing a lot of great spacing around Napheesa Collier. And, I mean, I've seen Alanna Smith go up against Jonquel Jones multiple times, who some may argue is one of the best centers in this league. And Alanna Smith, besides the last game on July 2nd, Alanna Smith held Jonquel to single digits. And she just is so deceivingly long. You don't, like, when you look at her, it's like, okay, maybe she's 6'3", 6'4", but then when you see her defend, her arms are so long. It's just, and her verticality in just not fouling people. That's what's been so impressive. I know. So she's a really good two-way player and essentially is, depending on the evening, the second or third option for the Minnesota Lynx, a top 3 team in this league. So, I'm getting very impassioned about it.
No, I get it. I mean, another thing I kind of want to highlight about her is maybe more so for the most improved discussion, not necessarily All-Star, but she shot 29.4% from 3 last year, and now she's shooting 47.7. Like, that's crazy. That's such a big swing. And a lot of that is probably the offense she's in and the team she's on. But it's just amazing to see that jump. And so I definitely get why you're, so passionate about her as an All-Star.
So who would I replace Alanna with? That is a great question. Oh my. I mean, it's difficult to look and be like, oh yes, Brittany Griner. But I think based on your point, looking at sort of who has played and who has not, I mean, BG missed a lot of this first half of the season, so there's a little bit of inconsistency there. I mean, BG, since she has returned, has been pretty remarkable, but, I definitely see, we know BG is a two-way threat, but I see the two-way threat a little bit more from Alanna Smith. So that's that. I think now, if you want to tell everyone about Ezzy Magbegor and why that is such an outrageous snub, because you're not the only one who thinks so.
No, I think Ezzy might be a bigger snub to me than Dijonai, and you heard how much I thought Dijonai should have been an All-Star. But I think the thing that really gets me is Ezzy Magbegor is one of the leaders in the Defensive Player of the Year discussion. And so if you're going to potentially win that big of an award, then not being an All-Star is pretty egregious. She was an All-Star last year. Her stats are relatively comparable to that. Granted, new year players are playing differently, etc. But that's kind of a jumping off point. And so her stats this year are 13.4 points per game, 8.8 rebounds, 2.4 assists, 1.6 steals, and 2.2 blocks per game. So, I mean, Ezzy's doing everything. She's doing everything for a good team as well. And the thing that stands out to me, again, is those 2.2 blocks and 1.6 steals. You want to talk about length. Ezzy's got length and then some. Her reach is crazy, and that's why she's blocking 2.2 shots per game. So I think, in terms of her impact, yeah, she impacts the game on offense, but on defense, there's no substitute for what she can do on defense in terms of, blocking shots, getting to passing lanes, affecting shots, changing the way different players want to play because, they don't want to go at her. So she's such a huge part of the Storm. And I think just, her not being in the All-Star game is wild to me. I really don't know what the disconnect was there, because when I watch her, I'm like, yeah, that's an All-Star for sure. When I watch her, I'm like, that's a Defensive Player of the Year. So Defensive Player of the Year should be an All-Star.
And she was an All-Star last year on a much worse team. Yes. I mean, let's talk about this in segment 3, but the Storm had 2 All-Stars on a team that was not very good. And so it just begs the question. I mean, the Storm have 2 again. I mean, once again, Jewel was a bit of an automatic. And I think, Eden, you touched on this earlier. Jewel hasn't been as spectacular as she was last year. I mean, I think that comes because they just have new pieces and they're working it out. But just the efficiency isn't sort of what you'd expect from Jewel Lloyd. And so last point on Ezzy, I know ESPN's Kevin Pelton has this WARP stat, which essentially it's an aggregated version of a player's contributions to a team. It's sort of saying how many wins is a team getting, I guess, above a replacement player. So apparently Ezzy has an 8.5 WARP. And according to Kevin, that is the highest WARP of a player that has not been an All-Star. So, yeah. So it's, essentially her WARP is at a level that usually All-Stars have. So that's the argument that Kevin makes. I will attach what he had to say to the show notes because it's very interesting. Now, I think the final snub we're going to go long on is Bennaja Laney-Hamilton. And it's interesting because I watched a little bit of the announcement show, which I missed because I was actually in Barclays covering Liberty versus Lynx, which was a riveting game. I mean, that should have been on ESPN. I obviously know why that it hasn't, but in terms of just such a compelling 40 minutes or 2 hours. It was back and forth and back and forth. But anyway, Monica McNutt, what stood out to her, she immediately said Bennaja Laney-Hamilton got snubbed from this list. That's what stood out to her. And I think when it comes, or a reason why I guess consider Bennaja Laney-Hamilton a snub is because of how much she does at a high level. And so she is, and you said this about Dijonai Carrington, She is guarding the best perimeter player on the opposition. She is also functioning as one of the Liberty's go-to one-on-one players when they can't really get something through one of their actions. It's Bennaja and Stewie. Those are the two who can sort of just, okay, I'm just going to pound it in and see what happens. Also, with Courtney Vandersloot out for around 8 games due to the death of her mother, Betnijah Laney-Hamilton essentially was playing the guard spot instead of the wing, which is she's usually the Liberty's starting 3. And so what that meant was she had to play a combo guard spot, which Sabrina Ionescu usually plays. And Sabrina Ionescu was switched to the 1. And so you saw Betnijah Laney-Hamilton playmaking at a high level, in addition to guarding the best player on defense and scoring in double digits per game. So if you look at the numbers here, she is scoring 12.3 points per game, which is about around what she had last year, which was 12.8. She is hitting 46% of her total field goals for a guard that is very good. 51% from 2 and 37.7% from 3. It's not fabulous, but it's pretty darn good. And so when you continue to look at her stat line, 4.5 rebounds, 3.6 assists, 1.4 steals. I mean, there is a lot that is registering there. But I think the much more compelling point, and this is from Richard Cohen at Her Hoop Stats, is the on-off numbers. So they indicate that the Liberty are 24.6 points per 100 possessions better with her on the floor. Ooh. So when you're talking, yes. So when you're
sorry, I don't know where that came from.
That is from Richard Cohen. He essentially listed out a bunch of snubs, and that's at Her Hoop Stats. I will attach that in the show notes. Exactly. That just shows the impact. I mean, similarly to what you were saying about Ezi Magbegor and her impact. I mean, it's less glamorous than sort of these top scorers that made the team. I mean, when you talk about who Betnijah Laney-Hamilton could have replaced, who sticks out to me is Kelsey Mitchell. And that sort of breaks my heart because I feel like Kelsey Mitchell has been snubbed so many times for All-Star. So I just wonder, is this not severance, but I just wonder, did the coaches sort of think about that? Or were they just sort of looking at the raw stats? Because if you do look at Kelsey Mitchell here, she is scoring higher than Betnijah Laney-Hamilton, 16.6 points per game. Her three-point percentage, 40.5%. But she doesn't have much else besides that. The rebounding numbers are low, 2. Assist numbers are low, 1.8. And as we know, Kelsey Mitchell is not a stout defender. So that's sort of who I would potentially replace. But, that would give the Liberty 4 All-Stars, while the Fever have 3. Yeah. Liberty are the best team in the league, while the Fever are 9th as of now, which that is what we are going to discuss in our next segment. So we're going to take a quick break, but coming up, we're going to quickly discuss how exactly we define who should be an All-Star. Stay with us. And we are back talking about All-Star snubs. I'm here with Eden. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you point blank, Eden. What, I guess, are some of the trends that we've noticed in our snubs, and what does that say about maybe what it means to be an All-Star?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we've talked about is, two-way players, right? I'm a big defense girl, always have been. So I'm looking at players who are going to make a big impact on both ends of the court. And I think when it comes to All-Star voting, we've seen, this year and in years past that's not necessarily something that people take into account. I think Ezi Magbegor, like we said, her block shots is a crazy thing to not take into account. But I think people have a really, really hard time with guards, especially. It's kind of telling whether or not they're a good defender, right? Block shot is easy to see when someone's sending the ball to the stands. Again, don't know how Ezzy didn't get in, but I think it is harder for people when they're looking at guards and saying, okay, how good is this person defensively, right? Because, like I mentioned, Dijonai Carrington, she gets like a steal per game, right? But she's doing so much more than that, and she's guarding the best player on the court. And I don't think people take those things into account when they're voting.
Which is so sad. Those of you that are watching on YouTube, those of you who are not, when Eden said I'm a defensive girl, I sort of agreed and lip worded too. So I actually looked at the Merriam-Webster's very vague definition of an all-star, and here's what it is. Composed wholly or chiefly of stars or of outstanding performers or participants. That is very vague.
Yes.
So I guess, what I want to ask you, Eden, is how much do you think popularity should matter versus how much of an outstanding player you are? And what exactly does it mean to be an outstanding player?
Yeah. I think for me, voting, popularity wouldn't matter. But again, I'm a media member, so those kind of things don't come into account. But, when you're looking at kind of the Fever have 3 All-Stars, it's like, well, yeah, a lot of people have been watching the Fever, right? And, a lot of that's because of Caitlin Clark, a lot of that's because of Leah Boston, a lot of that's because their games are on TV more than most other teams, right? So they're getting more All-Stars than maybe they should. And then in that case, popularity is definitely coming into play. But for me personally, voting, it wouldn't come into play at all. I'm looking for players that, can play both sides of the ball. I'm looking for players that are doing stuff that other people aren't, right? So like when I mentioned Angel Reese, I said, no one's doing the offensive rebounding that she is. So that to me is kind of important. I think it's tough because it's sort of a combo of individual and team performances, right? If I'm voting for an end of the year award like MVP, defensive player of the year, etc., you've got to be, one of the best players, but you also have to be on one of the best teams. I'm not voting for an MVP who's, got a losing record. But for All-Star, it's more of an individual performance to me. Like you can be on a team that's not great and be great. And for me, like an example would be Arike Ogunbowale right now. She's having an awesome season. The Wings aren't having an awesome season. But when it comes to having a ton of players from one team and that team's below 500, that kind of gets iffy for me because even though it's an individual thing, if you have 3 players who are 3 of the best players in the league having 3 of the best individual seasons, it should track that they're also having one of the best seasons as a team, right? So it's kind of tough that way to see sort of how it should shake out. But that's sort of my opinion. If any of that made sense, I sort of rambled there. But hopefully you can kind of decode what I was trying to say, Jackie.
No, it makes a ton of sense to me. I really think it does. Like, I think right now I'm looking and I'm seeing, okay, which teams have the most All-Stars, right? And so it's the Aces, and all 4 come from USAB, but I do think maybe half or 3/4 of that group is deserving. The Liberty have 3, and Stewie, Sabrina, Jonquel. I mean, that is very deserving. The Sun have 3. The Sun are one of the best teams in the league. We spoke about why earlier. That's deserving. You have then the Storm and the Lynx, who those are both great teams, but they only have 2. And then you have the Mercury with 3 and the Fever with 3. And you're sort of like, how does that work? Or do the Stars on the Mercury and Fever, their games are a little bit more conducive to, I guess, the flash that you want to see during an All-Star game? That's something I've thought about too.
For sure. I mean, this one will be a little different because it is Team USA versus, Team WNBA. But I've always thought it was kind of funny that I take such, defense into such account when they don't really play a lot of it in the All-Star game. But that doesn't impact the way they play all year long and what it means to be one of the best players in the league.
Exactly. I think we both agree that to be one of the best players in the league, you have to be the best in as many areas of the game as possible. So thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. I want to give a huge thank you to Eden for hopping on the show today. Eden, where can the people find your great work?
Yeah, so the people can follow me at Eden_Laase on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it. I do a lot of work for Yahoo, do some work for SB Nation. My old work is on Just Women's Sports, and hopefully I'll continue to write for a lot of different outlets because I love covering women's basketball, and I loved being on this with you, Jackie. So thank you so much.
Oh, that's brilliant. I appreciate that. Also, remember, Locked On has launched Locked On Sports Today. It is a 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. But anyway, have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And this has been Jackie Powell and
Eden Laase.
And we are signing off.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast